Hello everyone and welcome to Geometry Section 1-4, Sketching Intersections. This lesson is a really important one to geometry because just like the end of our last section, we're learning to sketch different figures and diagrams that can be really helpful in visualizing the math behind the geometry. So you're probably familiar with the term intersections. Roads intersect, rivers intersect, paths intersect, or cross. So in geometry, we say that two or more figures intersect when they have points in common. The intersection then would be the point or points that two or more figures have in common. This lesson gives us our third postulate. Remember from our last lesson, a postulate is just a statement that's accepted to be true without verification. This postulate talks about the intersection of two lines, and it tells us that if two lines intersect, then their intersection is a point. And this is pretty easy for us to visualize. Anytime we have two lines that cross, they meet in one single point. You can see the intersection of lines in a lot of different places in our day-to-day lives. So if you have a suspended ceiling in your house, you can look up at the ceiling and see those grid lines that hold in the tiles. All the tracks that the tiles fit into intersect at the corners. The gridding in some windows will intersect. Grout lines in tile intersect in points. So those are all examples of how two or more lines can intersect. So let's look at another intersection, the intersection of two planes. This postulate tells us that if two planes intersect, then their intersection is a line. So we'll sketch our two planes here, and I'll show you how to do this a little later on. But remember, a plane is just a two-dimensional figure that extends indefinitely in all directions. So when I sketch my plane, I'm going to start with that wall-like figure or quadrilateral when I draw mine. And then I've got two planes that are intersecting. And we'll talk about how to draw figures like this in a little bit. So the postulate tells us that if two planes intersect, and we're not talking about 747s crashing somewhere, but two geometric planes intersecting, then their intersection is a line. So look at where a wall meets the ceiling or the floor. At either one of those places you have a line. Anytime you have two planes that meet, if you traced along the edge of where they meet, you would be making a line. Okay, so let's sketch some of these things now. First, let's sketch a line in a plane. So you want to start by drawing your plane, and a plane, remember, we represent with just that quadrilateral. I usually use a parallelogram for mine to kind of give it that three-dimensional feel. And then we're just going to draw a line. Remember, it's a straight line with arrowheads on either end, and we're going to draw that inside of our plane. Alright, the intersection of that line and that plane would be the entire line, because the entire line lies in the plane. But now let's look at an example where the line intersects the plane at only one point. So if the line's not in the plane, this is what we'd see. So start by drawing our plane, and then you're going to want to pick the point where the line intersects the plane. So I'll put mine right in the middle here. And then it's usually easiest if you draw the top part first. So we'll do a ray coming out of that. And I'll just do my line straight up and down. So I'll go straight up from there. And then you want to draw the second half of the line down below. If you want to get really crazy and really reinforce that three-dimensional feel, you can use a dotted line wherever the two figures would overlap. So I'll draw the bottom of my line going straight down, and that's it. Okay, so now that we've covered the intersection of lines and planes, let's look at a line that doesn't intersect a plane. So you're going to draw your plane, and then somewhere else outside the borders of your plane, just go ahead and draw a line. That's a pretty easy one. Okay, moving on to intersecting planes. Now this one gets a little crazy. So I want you to start by drawing one plane, and instead of doing that parallelogram, why don't you start with just a rectangle? And then across the middle of our rectangle, we'll draw a line. This is going to be our intersection. We learned in our last postulate that the intersection of two planes is a straight line. So if I use that line, it will give me a guide as to where this next plane needs to cross. So now you want to just use that line as one of the edges on a parallelogram that comes out in front of the first plane that you drew. And then you'll continue that out behind your first plane, and remember, if you want to get crazy, go ahead and make those dotted lines wherever they overlap or where one would be behind the other, and make your parallelogram in the back, and there you go. Now, if you want to get really crazy, and I don't recommend you try this until you've practiced a few times, you can even draw the intersection of more than two planes. So I'll put a third plane in mine, and again, the same thing, they all need to meet at that line. Alright, so now that we've done our coloring fun for the day, let's look at a couple different intersections. So here we have 3 different lines intersecting, and naming these intersections is an important skill to have when you're working with geometry. So wherever lines intersect, we know that we're going to have a point. So when I look at line FJ here and line KM here, they need to meet at a point, and that point is point L. Now if I look at line NP and line KL, I can see that they intersect at a point as well, and that point is point G. And finally we have lines NP and FJ, and if I look at those two, they meet at point H. So down here we have 3 different planes in our figure. Remember, planes are named by those bold uppercase letters. So we have planes A, B, and C. Planes A and B look like they're about parallel to each other. They'll never intersect. And then plane C looks like it's about perpendicular to those two, so it intersects both of them. So the intersection of planes B and C. Now remember, you're talking about the intersection of 2 planes, so our answers to these will all be lines. So B intersects C at line FG, and remember that's the same thing as GF, and make sure you've got that arrow symbol over the top. Then we have planes A and C intersecting at line DE. Remember, it's the same thing as line ED. Planes A and B. Now I said earlier that these two looked like they were about parallel, and it doesn't seem like they're ever going to intersect each other, so they would have no intersection. Alright, well that's the end of lesson 1-4. Remember, you can go back in the video and review any of the things that we've talked about in this lesson. Thanks for joining me, and happy hypothesizing.